Delighted to welcome Katharina Umpfenbach as our guest speaker. Sort of like Ricarda and Johan, Katharina and I know each other. Katharina used to work at Ecologic Institute, so this is we're all very familiar with each other, moderators and guests for this particular episode. Katharina is now director of the infrastructure unit at DENA, which is the German German energy agency. So she's gone from some of the theory and advice work that we do at Ecologic to actually thinking about how to make these things happen. So, Katharina, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone. I will try to share this presentation. Well, I have to say that I might be a little bit closer to implementation. Maybe I say a few words about what DENA is. So, but not as close as maybe as you announced it. So the German Energy Agency is we belong to the German government, and we mostly work and support the environment, the economy and climate ministry of Germany in all its endeavors, both with advice before they decide on a policy and with stakeholder dialogues, and also in the implementation phase, where they hand out, for instance, support to or do need information to go across to certain actors. So that's a little bit of an idea of what we do. And I follow up directly on Johan's last point, that energy infrastructure is absolutely crucial for climate neutrality. I think one can easily say that the energy transition is actually also a huge infrastructure project. And I also have 3 points that I try to get across. We need to expand our energy infrastructure, but it's not only about quantity, it's also about a new quality that we need, and that has 2 core dimensions. Probably one can find others, but these are the keys for me. One is that we need to digitize our energy infrastructure, and the other is that we need to think it in a more integrated fashion. And what I mean by that is that we now have relatively separate infrastructure for gas, for electricity, and for heating. And in the future, these infrastructures will have to be much more integrated than they are now. And I expand a bit on these points. So I start with the power sector. Energy transition is always so focused on the power sector, and that's often seen as a deficit, and I think it is. But one reason why that is appropriate is that we're gonna, like, all the scenarios are showing us that we will electrify most of the use sectors. So most of the heating, virtually all of the transport, most of the transport, well, you can debate that, but a big share of that. And also there will be a lot of electrification in industrial processes. So that's why we're gonna have a lot more power consumption than we have now. So we have to expand the grid. We also have a very different power sector, mostly building on wind and solar as an input, which are variable renewables, and they're also cited very differently. In the past, we used to build the energy production and the consumption very close together. If you think in Germany, for instance, of the Ruhrgebiet, that's where the coal was, and that's where the heavy industry went. And now the siting is more determined by where the resources are. And so we need expansion on the transmission level, and that's the German picture. It's especially the north-south connection that needs to be enforced, but I don't have as many slides, but actually what we also need on the transmission levels is much more connections with our neighbors and overseas. But what people often forget, I think, or which is not so prominent, is that we also need a huge expansion on the distribution level. So the distribution level is where the households are served. And the reason for that is that most of the renewable energies will feed in at the distribution level. So if you think of PV especially, and then most of the electrification also happens on the distribution level. So all the new electric cars and the heat pumps and so forth will be connected at the distribution level. So here we need the scenarios, and I'm sorry for this focus on Germany because that's what I work on. But basically, all of these lessons can be extended to all European countries at least, and probably to many many countries globally. So we need a massive expansion quite soon, already before 2035. And that translates obviously to massive investment needs. Here what you see is sorry, I didn't translate. I have to translate you see the annual cost. So it includes both investment and operating costs for the distribution level for different scenarios, but they all pretty much show you that the costs double until 2045. So this gives you an indication for the kind of expansion that we're seeing. Now, it's important to understand that that doesn't mean that we pay double the grid fees, because we will also have much more electricity use. So per kilowatt hour, the increase will not be 100%, but will still be notable. And now if we go beyond the power sector, I think the biggest challenge is to build a completely new infrastructure, or let's say a new infrastructure system to transport hydrogen and possibly derivatives of hydrogen. We need that especially to decarbonize processes in industry. And that's sort of a challenge because the power grid is already there. We need much more of it, but the hydrogen grid is the whole system. So both the users and the producers and the lines between them are not there yet, and they basically all have to emerge in the same time to make it happen, which is quite a challenge, and points to some sort of state action needed to get it going. Here on the left side, you see the European hydrogen backbone, so how the gas grid operators envision that a future hydrogen grid could look like. You see quite a bit of offshore lines coming down from Norway, but also from Finland and Sweden, and then onshore connections of all kinds. And since July this year, we also have a first draft of how what they call the core grid for hydrogen in Germany could look like. So at the beginning, this is supposed to be done in 32, so well, 9 years from now, and the first lines are mostly connect import hubs like Wilhelmshaven with the key industrial sites, but then little by little it turns into a bigger sort of grid that covers most German regions, and then the big question is how much it will go further from there. Now, what are the challenges in expanding the grid? Well, we need financing for all that. Huge investments to be made. We need it in a very short time frame. So one key issue is how fast we can get those the licensing procedures done. That is a challenge at all levels. We need know-how, qualified personnel, and also production capacities. That's coming more and more into view. That right now, for instance, if you want to order a converter platform or even equipment for the distribution grid, you can easily wait several years as a grid operator. So this has really turned from a buyer's market. Is that correct? Like now the power is really with those who have the production capacities. And one key question is how can we make sure that those production capacities are expanding with the grid expansion that we need. There's a lot of a need for standardization, which is a challenge in a developing field. So that's mostly the case for hydrogen, where we're entering into a new world, but it's also true for things like electric chargers for vehicles and in all kinds of other interconnections between infrastructures. And then a key issue is also to secure a site, so just land space to build grid equipment. Land is always one of the most sort of sort of final resources that you can't multiply. So this is a problem, especially in urban and and suburban areas. That can be quite an issue, actually. And then in Germany, we have a specific challenge that only we have in Europe, is that we have a very high number of distribution grid operators, over 800 historically, that has evolved like that. And over 500 of them serve less than 100,000 customers, so they're pretty small. And they still need to manage all of these challenges. So there's a question if that's viable in the long term. But yeah, politically sensitive, as you can imagine. Digitalization, now I will focus on the power grid. There are a few, I think, also avenues for digitalization in the other areas, but I think it's in the power grid where it's most pertinent. We need digitalization to efficiently integrate variable renewable energy. That's the main reason we're doing it, and to efficiently integrate the new load, so mostly electric cars and heat pumps, and to ensure grid stability at all times. Because, well, as you're probably all aware, the demand and supply of electricity always has to be on par all the time. And that's quite a challenge with many more decentralized actors getting involved. And more concretely, it's really about flexibility. So when we have variable wind and solar production in an ever larger sort of making up an ever larger quantity of total generation capacity, we need to become more flexible on the demand side too, which is a paradigm shift of how the electricity system was designed. It was always designed so that the supply would provide the flexibility to always serve the demand that was there. And now that has to change. And to do that with lots gets you even more actors, because now you have the demand side, which is also interacting in some way. And that will only work if it's done in some way automated by digital processes that communicate and even steer certain changes and reactions. And then a thing that's probably not as known is that we have very good, or the grid operators have a very good view of what's happening in the transmission system at all times. But on the distribution grid, because that's much, much larger, there's only a few points in the system where the grid operator can see what happens in real time. And that needs to change as well. We need more sensors and technology that gives the grid operators a better view of what's happening on the distribution grid, just because we will get a much more interactive system than we had in the past. On flexibility, now, in the past, you see this gray wedge here. Flexibility came, and actually even today, to a large extent, flexibility comes from conventional generation. So, and not only flexibility, also certain how do you say, system services are provided by the big conventional generation plants. And in the future, the flexibility need will increase because we have this variable production, and you can say there are several new wedges that can provide it. Well, one is renewable energy can provide flexibility. Some renewable energy technologies like biogas and biomass can react to demand, are dispatchable, as we say, or you can curtail wind and solar. People don't like to see that, but actually as it gets ever cheaper, that's a viable and can be a cost-efficient flexibility option. We can have storage. We're seeing a huge increase in battery storage. But also there are a lot of other storage options, heat storage, even storage based on all kinds of technologies. So there's a huge development potential here. And then there's demand flexibility, which we only do to a very limited extent so far, because of a number of regulatory barriers, and because in Germany we also lack the enabling technology, mostly smart meters. So that's the key areas for work in the future. And then one last point is this integration I was talking about. That's what I work on personally. So I thought I bring that to the webinar today. We have planning processes for both gas infrastructure and electricity infrastructure, which is regulated based on EU law and then specific German law, where basically there is a scenario framework where they say we think the future might look like that or that. You know, they make up a sort of a corridor of future pathways, and then they look more closely what these scenarios mean for the network development. And that network development plan that the system that the grid operators develop is then checked by the regulatory authority, in our case, the Bundesnetzagentur. And out of that comes sort of a list of key infrastructure projects, which also have some privileges in the process afterwards. And then comes the actual licensing, the actual planning of the specific lines. Now, in the past, these processes for gas happened relatively separately for gas and power. Now, in the future, you will see a lot of sector coupling, we call it, a lot of integration between the sectors. One key integration is electrolyzers, so the plants that produce hydrogen and then feed into this new hydrogen grid once we have it. And they are a big load on the power system. So it's very important, for instance, where they are located and how they are run. So this is one element that links those two infrastructures, for instance, and there's a few more. And so what the government has come up with is the idea to have a system development strategy, so a process that is that happens before those specific planning processes begin. And that's the idea, to have a joint vision for the whole of the energy system that then is consistently used in all of the subsequent specific infrastructure planning processes. And that's what DENA is involved in and what I am involved in. And we do it together with energy system modelers that provides the basis, so also scenario building. And then a sort of a lot of runs to ensure that these are robust scenarios under different things that could happen. And then we have a year-long stakeholder dialogue to see that, to see where our blind spots are, and also to get sort of a reality check of, what might happen in the real world that might influence developments. And out of that comes sort of what we will probably call a transformation scenario. So one lead scenario, if you want, that describes the energy future for 2030, 2045, and will then feed into the specific infrastructure planning processes. Now, obviously, we don't know today how 2040 will look like exactly, and that is why it's very important for us that this process is repeated every 2 years. We call it a learning strategy, so that we can incorporate new developments, new technological developments, new market developments, and adapt the process.